Thank you, Alex. That was a very warm introduction. Well, in thinking about this talk today, I was thinking about the Christmas and New Year's thing that we do. It's kind of ritual. At least in this country and Canada and South America and Western Europe and in Japan, New Year, yeah. So a lot of places in New Year, we have this ritual where we try not to be unhappy. This is what I'm thinking for the first time today. It's like there's this designated time. We have to have at least one time of the year that's designated where we're going to try to be happy, despite everything that's going on in the world, And it happens every year. We have to take some time out every year and say, let's dedicate these next week and a half or 10 days to not trying to get succumbed by all the tragedies of the war, or the world and the war. So, so on that note, I also thought this is actually going through the middle of the night as I'm preparing. I didn't have that much time to prepare for this talk because I was the tenzo, the cook for this Rohatsu Sesshin. And the first thing that comes to my mind is if I'm going to give a talk after I've been the cook for a week, I'm going to talk about cooking. So but this time I decided I wouldn't. And what I decided I would do is talk about something I think probably all of you have heard me talk about before, or others, and maybe as soon as a few days ago, because I'm going to talk about basically the enlightenment story of the Buddha and its first communication to another human being. And we've talked about this many times, but I also thought I have a best buddy and his father, who was a prominent member of our small town, city in western Iowa. He was a Presbyterian, and every year on Christmas Eve, he would give this little soliloquy of the birth of Jesus, just like a 20-minute story. It's the same story, but he did it every year, and every year the church would fill up to hear this story. He just had a way of telling it that was very serene and still. And I think that's what the people appreciated about it, even though it was the same story every year. So I think it's good, as we all know, if a valuable piece of literature is worth going over many, many times. So this is my talk for today. It's about one is on two different suttas. One is from the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's called the Ariyapariye Sana Sutta. And the other one is from a Samyutta Nikaya, and I'll tell you about that when I get there. But in this sutra, it's called the Noble Search. That's the translation. the Buddha tells the story to several, many, I don't know how many bhikkhus who had assembled about how he began his search for awakening. So I'm going to read the whole introductory part, which simply because every now and then these unusual things sort of happen in the Pali and the canon, and most of it's really, really dry. So if you find something unusual, it kind of tickles you a little bit, and you think, wow, this is interesting, even though according to usual literature, even the most interesting things in the Pali Canon are pretty dry. In any event, here we go. Thus I have heard, on one occasion, the fortunate one was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anantapindika's park. When it was morning, the fortunate one dressed and went to Savatthi for alms. And then while the fortunate one was going for alms, a number of bhikkhus came to Ananda and said, it's been a really long time since we've heard a Dharma talk from, Shakyamuni himself, the fortunate one himself. We think it'd be good if we had a talk pretty soon. And so that in itself is just sort of an interesting thing for me. And it's been a long time since we've heard a talk. It's not like Katagiri, it was twice a week. It's like slow down. We don't need this much. Just maybe once every couple of weeks a talk. But it was like a lot of. He gave a lot of talks. So I'm just wondering, I wonder how long. How long did he not give a talk for? Was it a month or 2 months? He just didn't say anything? I don't know. So Ananda says, let the venerable ones go to the Brahman Ramaka's hermitage. Perhaps you will get to hear a talk on Dharma from the fortunate one's own lips. Yes, they said. Yes, friend. Well, they replied. So you have to, as the story goes on, this is why I'm reading it, actually telling it. I'll just go. So then the fortunate one had wandered for his alms. And after he ate his meal, he addressed Ananda and said, Ananda, let's go to the Eastern Park for the day's abiding. And Ananda says, yes, sounds good. So they went there and they spent the day there. Then the Blessed One went to the Venerable, and then they said, Ananda, let's go to the palace of Megira's mother too. So they went there, and then Ananda says, after they bathed too in that place, Ananda says, Venerable One, the hermitage of Ramaka is very near. Why don't we go and stay there for a little while? And in case what's happening here is Ananda's being a little manipulative, in case you don't get that. He's kind of sly that way, and he kind of sneaks things in. And so he kind of maneuvered the Buddha to go to this place. So they went there, and the blessed one, fortunate one, he consents in silence. So they go, and then they arrive at Ramaka's hermitage. And on that occasion, a number of bhikkhus were sitting together in the hermitage discussing Dhamma. The fortunate one stood outside the door waiting for their discussion to end. When he knew that it was over, he coughed and knocked. And the bhikkhus opened the door for him. And they sat down on a seat. He sat down on a seat. And he asked them, what were you doing here, sitting together now? And what was your discussion about? Venerable Sir, our discussion on the Dharma that was interrupted by the fortunate one was about the fortunate one. So anyway, they were talking actually about Buddha. And then, so but in terms of Dharma, things like that. So the fortunate one said, good, it's fitting for you when you people have come together out of faith from home life into homelessness to sit together to discuss Dharma. When you gather together, you should do either of two things: hold discussions on the Dharma or maintain noble silence, he says. So then he goes on and he says, so I just wanted, I kind of told that introduction mainly because I wanted you to see how Ananda kind of works his ways sometimes. It came up during this Rohatsu session. I think you all know that Ananda would be the male person who was most responsible for finding a way for women to enter become nuns, becomes part of the Sangha. And he did that out of ways of working his mind a bit. So the Buddha says there are two kinds of search: the noble search and one that's not so noble. And what is the noble search? A person, or what is the search that's not as noble as noble as the other? It's a person being subject to birth seeks what is also subject to birth. Being subject to aging seeks what is also subject to aging, and the same with sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement. And what might be said that is subject to birth? A wife and children, men and women slaves, goats, sheep, fowl, pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares, gold and silver. These are objects of attachment. They are subject to birth, and one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being subject to birth, seeks what is also subject to birth. And Kyoko gave a talk during this session on another one of my favorite sutras, calling what is born from those who are near and dear. Born from those who are near and dear. And a parent who has lost their only child goes to the Buddha and explains the suffering he has had, and Buddha basically says this is what comes from those who are near and dear to us. And it's kind of a bit of a controversial thing, as you can, I think we can all imagine, or we all would say, isn't it, those who are closest to us that give us the greatest joy and happiness? And the Buddha didn't actually come from that perspective. And Kyoko gave a very beautiful rendition of the story. There I actually wanted to say during your talk, Kyoko, there are 2 points I wanted to add that are very meaningful to me in that story that you didn't mention. And maybe I can briefly say it. What happens is Buddha says this to this man, and this man becomes very distraught. Say, no, it's happiness and joy that come from those who are near and dear. And so he goes away, says, I'm done with you. And he goes away, and he sees some gamblers sitting around. I said, what do they think? And so he goes and approaches those. I was just with this guy who said that fear, that all of our suffering comes from those who are close from us. And the gamblers say, oh, no, he's all mixed up. He's all mixed up. And you didn't actually say this, Kyoko. They said, no, happiness. Happiness is what comes from all the people close to us and our friends. So sit down, join us, and have a glass of wine and gamble with us. So he said, oh, these guys got it right. So that was his take on it. And so that's one part of the story. And then it reaches the queen Malika. It reaches the king, Pasenadi, first. And everything, suffering is born from those who are near and dear. And he says, what? What could that be about? And he told it to his wife, Queen Malika. And what do you think about that, Queen Malika? And Queen Malika says, well, if the Blessed One said it, it's got to be true. and the part you didn't tell about the story, Kyoko, that I really like is King Pasenadi says, yeah, whatever the Buddha says, Queen Malika says it's true. It doesn't matter. He could say this, and you would think it's true. He could say that, and you would think it's true. So I like this little dialogue. Maybe they needed marital counseling, but in any event, it's a little detail in the story that I like that you didn't mention. So I'll stop there. So, and then what is the noble search? It's one, realizing these things seeks what's not subject to birth and death, things like that. And what is the noble search? Here, someone being subject to birth, having understand the danger in what is subject to birth, seeks the unborn supreme security from bondage, nirvana. So then he goes, that's the beginning. Then he goes and he tells the story of leaving the home. And there's lots, in this particular sutra, there's not a lot of detail. We can find a lot of other detail about him living in his palace and the 4 signs. But he just said he left home when he was a black-haired young man endowed with the blessings of youth and the prime of life. Though my mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the yellow robe, and went forth from home life into homelessness. I was just rereading that. I mean, again, just preparing. And it caught me for a moment, this life of going from home to homelessness, home life into homelessness. And I'm just thinking what a kind of profound thing that is. Because, you know, I live here, I'm ordained. But there's always a tendency, a very, very strong tendency for us to get a home of some nature or another. And this is my home. I am living in a room right now, staying in a room. And yet some people might say, wow, you moved into a monastery or something like that, really kind of letting go of things. But there's so much I haven't let go. If you were to keep going back to how the Buddha's homelessness was, wow, it was just nothing. Every day you didn't have food guaranteed for you, and didn't know where you're going to sleep. So then he tells about his search, and he went to the two most famous teachers at that time, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. And they were great teachers, and Buddha mastered what they said. And the first teacher invited him to be his co-teacher with him for this Sangha. I won't go through what the practices were. It would be a little too detailed, but they're interesting. And Udaka Ramaputta actually said, you can take over the order. You're more accomplished than I am. But the Buddha did not find true liberation from these people, from these teachings. And he was very courteous and left and said, I need to do something different. So it basically, he did a lot of things, austerities, and on and on. And finally, he went down and he sat under a tree, the Bodhi tree, and he sat there until he became awakened. And he said, my deliverance is unshakable. Now there is no renewal of being. And just visiting that again today, no renewal of being. What could that be about? No renewal of being. No, there's just a way we're living, but nothing's being created in sense of an I. No renewal of being. There's a little later I'll talk about the first sermon he gave to his disciples. And he talks about the craving for the renewal of being. So just breathe into that a couple of times. No renewal of being. What kind of silence or non-activity could that be? So I've told this before, but when he had that awareness, when he awakened to that, he considered this Dharma that I have attained is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning. subtle to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in worldliness, takes delight in worldliness, rejoices in worldliness. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely specific conditionality, dependent origination. And it's hard to see this truth, namely the stilling of all formations, of the relinquishing of all attachments, the end of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. If I were to teach this truth, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. Therefore, there came to me this spontaneous stanzas. Enough with teaching the Dharma. It will never be perceived. Those died in lust, wrapped in darkness, will never discern this abstruse Dhamma, which goes against the worldly stream, subtle, deep, and difficult to see. Considering that, my mind inclined to inaction rather than teaching. So why wouldn't it be that way? Why wouldn't you just say, oh, this is great, I'm just going to hang out like this, rather than incline myself to all the worry and distress that I'm going to have to face if I have to teach this. Well, then, as we know, the Brahma Shahapati, one of the gods, came down from the heaven, and they knew what Buddha was thinking. And they said, no, there's people in this world who can understand. And it's always I always have noted, I learned from a tape I read at a talk that Stephen Batchelor gave at Dharma Field, that the Brahma Shahapati was the god of creativity. So that suggests to me that the Buddha is going to have to get very creative about teaching the Dharma. So he decides to teach the Dhamma. And he decides he was going to go to Alara because he knew the two former teachers, but they had both died within the past 2 weeks. So he went back to his 5 disciples, sitting in that he had abandoned. And he taught them this. There are 2 extremes which are not to be embraced by a person who has set out on the path. The practice of clinging to sensory pleasure and sensory objects. This practice is lowly, common, ordinary, dishonorable, and unprofitable. And the practice of exhausting oneself with austerities. This practice is distressful, dishonorable, and unprofitable. And just today, when I was rereading this, I was just noticing that he called the 2 extremes, one's going after sensory, keep accumulating things. He calls it lowly, common, ordinary, dishonorable, and unprofitable. But he calls the practice of exhausting oneself through austerities as distressful, dishonorable, and unprofitable. But he doesn't call it lowly, common, or ordinary. So it's just a little note. I just only noticed that the first time this morning. So he did that. We all know the story. He practiced austerities to the extreme. In one of the sutras, it says he would touch his stomach and he would actually think he was touching his stomach, but he was touching his backbone. That image always has stayed with me. So I'm gonna move a little quickly. We've heard this sutra before, and it's a beautiful sutta, but our time is moving along. But he says he tells these group of bhikkhus to avoid these two extremes and go by a middle way that engenders insight and understanding and leads to calmness. It is precisely the eightfold component path, preeminent eightfold component path, which is namely sound view, sound inclination, sound speech, action, livelihood, effort, awareness, and concentration. And he says, basically, I'm going to summarize, is we need to fully understand what unease is. Completely understand, he told these monks. Go to the very bottom of what is the unease that we experience. And he says the same with how is unease created? Where does it come from? And go to the bottom of that. And then go to the bottom of the cessation of unease. This has to be fully realized. And of course, the sutra is very elegant in its language. And after he said that, the five medicants delighted at the words. And one of them, whose name was Kondana, when this discourse was being spoken, there arose for the venerable Kondana this dustless, stainless insight. All that is subject to origination is subject to cessation. So when that happened, all these resplendent activities happened. An earthquake, God's cried out from the heavens, things like that. Thus, at that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry extended as far as the Brahma realm in this 10,000-fold cosmos trembled, shook, and violently quaked. An immeasurable great radiance appeared in the cosmos, exceeding the brilliant majesty of the resplendent beings themselves. Then the fortunate one exclaimed this inspired utterance. So you really know, Kondana. So you really know. And that is how the Venerable Kondana acquired the name Anna Kodana. Kodana, who knows? Okay. So the reason that sutra speaks to me so deeply is because that was the first time that what the Buddha understood was communicated to another human being. It actually was communicated. So that means that the peace or the stillness that the Buddha realized is able for, we can realize it too. So that's my talk for today. And it's 10:06. So I'll open it up to anything else. Anybody else wants to add?
I want to add a detail that I just found out this Rohatsu because I was reading things more in more detail, and my mind was more concentrated. But the part where when he has taken a little time to have all kinds of openings and dreams after his initial breakthrough, and he has his visit from I forget what the name of the being that came to say, no, no, you can't not teach, and
Lama Shahapata.
that means something. It's something like creativity or something like
Mm.
that.
Mm.
Anyway, uh, what really moved me was when he got to his five compadres, and they were determined. They talked to each other. They said, we're not going to be rude, but this guy is just going in the wrong direction. So, let's keep it short. But as soon as he got closer, they they just couldn't help themselves. It was like, oh, have a seat. It's good to see you. Well, clean your feet. And apparently, they had some food that they'd gotten that morning um, that was uh, apparently enough for five people, something like that. And so he sat down, and they were like, you know, you've really lost it. And he said, no, actually, the exact opposite happened. And here's what happened. So he goes through it, but he doesn't just go through it once. They argue back. No, it's like you're taking food. You're just really going in the opposite direction. And he's like, no, listen to me. I really know about this. And he does that for a second time. And they come back and they say, no. And the third time he comes back and says, yes. And finally he stops and he says, Dokai will remember the words of this, or maybe Alex and Bo will, but he says, have you ever heard me talk like this before? And so they're thinking about it. Meanwhile, Kandana, the wheels are turning. They're like, and so Buddha starts again, and in the kind of in the middle of saying, really, this is something different. Really, I really know what I'm talking about. So he's doing this with, in this argument, and then all of a sudden Kandana says, so everything passes away. Everything that arises passes away. And we're not even sure whether he actually said it out loud, but all of a sudden, Buddha knows that Kandana knows. And he says, Kandana knows! Kandana knows! And I just, there was just something about this okay, we're still human beings, we're still arguing about this stuff. This is, something that's lasted for 2,500 years. And these guys are going, well, if you're going to eat things, so there's this very human argument going on. And then I just felt that I felt like he must have when finally one of them just went, oh, like this was his first teaching, his first real connection with people that really mattered and could really appreciate it. So I because the first guy that Buddha met on the road was just a guy walking down the road, and he was, he thought, boy, this guy's got a certain something about him. He's kind of glowing. He's a very handsome young man, blah, blah, blah. And so he stops and talks to him and kind of said, you're looking really good. Sort of, did anything happen? And Buddha does his basically, I'm the perfect one thing. And the guy's like, sounds like, I forget, there's a phrase, a something victor. And Buddha's like, yeah, that's exactly right. He goes, well, have a good day. And just keeps going. And so, in contrast to that, after, struggling with his 5 guys, and then suddenly discovering that Kandana knows, was just delightful. And somewhere sort of a little further on in the winding down of that first meeting, they decide to have a meal. And it's like, and we have some left over. And it's one of these things where you never think about, well, how much food do they get in their bowls, and how does this all work? Just like you were talking about, Dokai, with, leaving home. This is something that you really have to sit down and think about to even sort of get in touch with how thoroughly he left home. So, because each of them is kind of sort of opening, with Kandana's opening, then there's more opening among them as they're eating and just kind of getting back to being connected. So it's such a human story. So much of the teeny weeny detail is actually in the Pali Canon that I just wanted to share my delight of that. Thank you. And thank you for reminding me about Queen Malika and Pasanati. It was just a classic interaction. It's like, you would say that. You always say that. Whatever he says is so. Happy Rohatsu, everybody.
Let me see, I don't have headphones on, and I don't think I had a microphone on the headphones. Anyway, this origin of the teaching story is always interesting. And one of the teachers that I listened to, a Kensho Weber, in one of his talks said that the genius of the Buddha was not that he figured all this stuff out and had his enlightenment. He mentioned, it's very possible and probably likely that there were other individuals who had reached that same conclusion after doing practices and stuff like that. But we never heard of them because they didn't teach. If you go back over history, the likelihood is that there were other enlightened people around, but they weren't able to communicate that, much less teach it for 40 years. And that was the ultimate genius of the Buddha, was that he could take that experience and communicate it to crowds of people, and for it to last for millennia, the teachings. And I think that's what I think of. And that was his talent, to do it. Anyway, thanks for the talk, okay? Nice to see you all.